Here's something most personal finance advice never tells you. The exact same dollar is not worth the same amount depending on when you invested. Put a dollar into the market at 25, and by the time you retire, it could be worth close to 4 times more than that identical dollar invested at 45. Same market, same return. The only variable is time. And once you actually understand why that's true, I'll start once I'm more settled. Stop sounding responsible and start sounding expensive. So in this video, I want to make the real case for going after financial independence early. Not because youth is some magical trait, but because of what being young actually gives you access to. Time, energy, and room to take risks that gets harder to find with every year that passes. We'll go through the actual math behind it, why the exact same risk gets more expensive as you get older, and why most play it safe advice is aimed at the wrong stage of life entirely. Stay with me until the end, because the last reason is the one almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one on this list. Point 1. The math nobody explains. Let's start with the math because it's the most underrated part of this entire conversation. Money doesn't grow in a straight line. It grows in a curve. That's the whole idea behind compounding. Your returns start earning their own returns, and the earlier you feed money into that curve, the more time it has to bend upward. Here's the simplest way to see it. Assume a long-term average return of roughly 7% a year, which is close to what a diversified stock portfolio has historically returned over long stretches. Though obviously, past performance never guarantees future results, and markets don't move in a straight line year to year. Put $1,000 in at 25 and leave it completely alone until 65, and you're looking at somewhere around $15,000. Put that same $1,000 in at 35, and by 65, it's closer to $7,500, about half. Wait until 45, and it only reaches around $3,900, roughly a quarter of what it could have been. Same amount of money, same market, same effort on your part. The only difference is when you pressed start. That 10-year gap between 25 and 35 doesn't cost you 10 years of growth. It costs you nearly half of your eventual outcome. That is not a small trade-off. That is basically the entire game. To be clear, this isn't an argument for dumping every dollar you own into the market tomorrow. It's that whatever you are able to invest early gets a head start that money invested later simply cannot back, no matter how much more you eventually earn. Picture two people. One invests $300 a month starting at 25 and stops entirely at 35. Just 10 years of contributions, then never adds another dollar. The other waits until 35 to start and contributes that same $300 a month all the way to 65. 3 full decades of steady saving. Assume that same 7% average return for both. The person who only invested for 10 years and then stopped usually ends up with more money at 65 than the person who invested for 30 straight years. Not because they saved more, they actually saved far less. They just gave the market more time to work. That's the entire argument in one example. Time in the market does more heavy lifting than the amount of money you put in. Point 2. Skills compound too. But money isn't the only thing that compounds. Skills do the same thing. Getting genuinely good at anything takes repetitions, and the earlier you start racking them up, the bigger the runway you build before everyone else catches up. Warren Buffett bought his first shares of stock at 11 years old. Sarah Blakely spent years selling fax machines door to door before she used that same relentless hustle to build Spanx from scratch. Different paths, same underlying pattern. An early start on a skill compounds quietly for years, and then all at once. There's also a reputation effect that almost nobody talks about. The exact same accomplishment means something different depending on how old you are when you pull it off. A 23-year-old who builds a profitable business gets written about, gets introduced to mentors, gets invited into rooms most people spend a decade trying to reach. A 55-year-old with that same business? Respected, sure, but nobody's calling it a breakout story anymore. Fair or not, youth works as a multiplier on whatever you accomplish. The attention it earns, the people it connects you to, the capital it attracts. And here's the part that should bother you a little. That multiplier doesn't last. For most people, it quietly disappears somewhere in their 30s. Point 3. Early wins are platforms, not just wins. The third piece is that early wins aren't just wins, they're platforms. Almost nobody's path to real wealth is one clean leap. It's a series of stepping stones where whatever you build first gives you the credibility, the capital, or the skill set to build the next thing bigger. A first side hustle teaches you how to sell. That funds a small business. Running that business teaches you how to manage people and money under pressure, which is exactly what eventually lets you raise capital or start something with real scale. Every rung depends on the one underneath it already existing, which means the earlier you lay down that first stepping stone, the more rungs you actually have time to climb before the ladder runs out. If you've made it this far, here's the part most people skip past. None of this requires you to already be rich or already be talented. It just requires you to start the clock earlier than you're currently planning to. Point 4. Energy, flexibility, fewer obligations. Now let's talk about what being young actually gives you, practically speaking. Energy is the obvious one. Putting in the hours it takes to get good at something fast simply costs more out of you at 45 than it does at 22. That's not a criticism, that's just biology. But the bigger advantage is fewer obligations. In your 20s, there's a decent chance you don't have a mortgage, kids, or a partner whose career is tied to a specific zip code. That means you can go wherever the opportunity actually lives. Want to break into finance? That industry is still concentrated in a handful of cities. Want to build in tech? Same story. When you're unattached, you can live cheaply, work unreasonable hours, and take risks that would be genuinely irresponsible once other people are depending on your paycheck. You can take the lower-paying job that teaches you more. You can move across the country for an opportunity that might not pan out. You can spend a weekend learning a new skill instead of resting, because your body can still absorb that kind of pace. None of these choices are available in quite the same way once you've got a family relying on stability, or a mortgage that needs to be paid whether the new venture works out or not. That window doesn't stay open forever, and it's one of the most underrated assets a young person has. Not because you're smarter than anyone else, but because you're simply freer to move. Point 5. Failure is cheaper when you're young. There's one more advantage that rarely gets its own spotlight: the actual cost of failing. Every risk you take has two sides, the upside if it works, and the downside if it doesn't. What most people don't factor in is that the downside itself gets more expensive with age, even when the risk looks identical on paper. If a 24-year-old starts a business and it fails, they've lost some money and a couple of years, and they still have 4 decades of working life left to rebuild, apply what they learned, and try again with better odds. If a 50-year-old takes that same risk and it fails, the math is brutal in a completely different way. They don't have 4 decades left to recover. They have to rebuild retirement savings on a much shorter runway, often while supporting a family, a mortgage, or aging parents at the same time. This is why the safe choice actually flips as you get older. In your 20s, avoiding risk altogether is often the more expensive decision because you're trading away decades of potential compounding for a sense of security you don't yet need. In your 50s, playing it safe is usually the correct move because the runway to recover from a bad bet has mostly run out. In other words, the same exact risk is not the same risk at every age. It's cheap when you're young and expensive when you're not. Most people build their entire relationship with risk backwards, cautious when caution costs them the most, and only aggressive once caution would have actually served them better. Point 6. Model the rule, not the exception. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. What about the people who built serious wealth later in life? They exist. Colonel Sanders famously didn't franchise KFC until his 60s. Those stories are real, and they're inspiring precisely because they're rare. But here's the uncomfortable part. If you actually study where most self-made wealth comes from, the majority of it traces back to decisions made early. The business started at 24, the stock bought at 26, the skill learned at 20 that finally paid off a decade later. You can absolutely build wealth starting later in life. It's just, statistically, the harder path. And if the easier path is still available to you, why wouldn't you take it? Let's bring this together. The math shows that early dollars grow into far more than later dollars ever can, even at identical contribution levels. Skills and reputation compound the same way, quietly building leverage that gets harder to replicate the longer you wait. Every early win becomes a platform for the next one. So the earlier you place that first stepping stone, the more of them you get to stack over time. You have more energy and fewer obligations right now than you likely ever will again. And the risk you're avoiding today is, mathematically, cheaper than the risk you'll be forced to take later, once the runway to recover has shrunk. None of this is really about age, though. It's about what you do with the position you're in right now. If you're young, this is the cheapest your risk will ever be. Take advantage of it. If you're not young anymore, the lesson doesn't disappear. It just means the best time to start was a few years ago, and the second best time is today, because every year you wait is a year that compounding doesn't get to work on your behalf. Most people don't fail to build wealth because they lack a good opportunity. They fail because they're waiting for a certainty that never arrives. There is no perfect moment where the risk feels comfortable and the outcome feels guaranteed. The only decision that actually matters is whether you're willing to move before you feel ready. If this gave you a clearer way to think about building wealth, hit subscribe. This channel is built around making financial decisions easier to understand and easier to actually act on. And if you know someone who keeps saying, "I'll start next year," send them this video. Sometimes the math is more convincing than the advice ever could be. And if today's the day you actually decide to start, even with something small, that's genuinely the only step that matters. Drop a comment telling me what you're starting with. I read every one.